Hi, my name is Myrella, and today I'm going to be talking about what went down on December 7th, 1941 in Pearl Harbor. And more importantly, was Pearl Harbor really a surprise attack? What did Franklin D. Roosevelt know, and when did he know it? December 7th, 1941, the day that changed America forever. The December 7th, 1941 Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was one of the most defining moments in American history. But why? Firstly, America was unprepared and considerably weakened. Secondly, the attack caused the U.S. to formally enter World War II. Lastly, memory of the sneak attack fueled the U.S. determination to fight. But was it really a sneak attack? I am going to be presenting 4 main points. First, this was a carefully planned attack by the Japanese. In November 26, 1941 U.S. peace plan with Japan, the U.S. discusses a peace plan throughout Pacific areas where they mention territorial integrity, equality, and cooperation all achieved through peaceful methods. Further requests reject Japan's proposals made on November 20th. After all of this, how could American political leadership be surprised by an attack at Pearl Harbor? Just look at the headlines of Gila, a Hawaiian newspaper, after this meeting. Point 2. This was not a sneak attack at all. Did FDR allow the Japanese to attack on December 7th, 1941? There are 3 main theories for this. 1. Roosevelt and Churchill. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill knew about the assault in advance and told Roosevelt, but they both agreed to sit on the information, obviously having some sort of arrangement. 2. Churchill did not tell. Churchill knew of the attack but did not tell Roosevelt. 3. Not only was Roosevelt aware of the attack, but actively had a hand in orchestrating it. He was known to have been sympathetic to allies, but could not intervene because it would have gone against public sentiment to engage in European war. Roosevelt was frequently quoted as saying that he would never put American soldiers into foreign wars. This is a video from 1945 Life magazine titled FDR Knew.
You know, it's a funny thing how certain things turn out to be fact in history books. Our government will lie, and that lie will become a fact. Let me show you something that a lot of people today are still debating over. This is a Life magazine from September 24th, 1945. Shows Colonel Jimmy Stewart on the cover. Jimmy Stewart, the actor who volunteered for service during World War II, flew combat missions over Germany, over all of Europe. Quite a hero, really, and a patriot. Well, the article that appears on page 110 is titled Pearl Harbor. And it says, the facts were known to Republican presidential candidate Thomas Dewey in 1944. He withheld his fire, but now is the time to assess their meaning. And what they're talking about is this, ladies and gentlemen. For a long time, the official explanation of Pearl Harbor was that we were slugged without warning when we were innocently going about our business. Slugged we were, but there's no need to explain Japanese behavior. But to say that we were slugged without warning is a radical distortion of the truth. Roosevelt, the chief executive of the nation and the commander-in-chief of its Army and Navy, knew in advance, knew in advance that the Japanese were going to attack us. And it goes on further in the article to point this out, that they may not have known the precise location of the attack, but the Japanese code had been solved for some time, and they knew that they were launching an attack against us, and we were not preparing our Army and Navy and Air Force to withstand that attack. In fact, in many cases, what we were doing was even making sure that we could be attacked. Now, I know that's hard to believe for a lot of people, and there's still a lot of conservatives, a lot of people out there that don't believe this. This is not the only case. There was also an article, a major article in the Chicago Tribune during these years that also brought out the fact that we knew we were going to come under attack, etc. The thing about it was that we have this history that we're told on the History Channel, in our history books in schools, that the Japanese came here and they just fooled us. They pretended like they wanted peace while in fact they were preparing for war. But that is true, but not the way they present it. What didn't come out was that Kinoue, who was a moderate Japanese prince, wanted peace. He sent, quote, Kinoue sent a moderate by comparison with the Japanese militarist party. Kinoue sent word to Ambassador Grew that he would like to meet Roosevelt on U.S. soil, either in Hawaii or Alaska. His proposal for peace with China, handed to Ambassador Grew by the Japanese Minister for Foreign Affairs on September 22, 1941, was hardly satisfactory. And so what they wanted to do, and part of this, and they've got it at the end of this article, is that they were going to agree to a peace with China, a partial withdrawal initially from Indochina, ultimately out of China, as long as certain things, certain conditions were met. Those conditions were simply reestablishing economic ties with the United States, an ample supply of oil. And in regard to all of this, what a lot of people don't understand, and I already put this down so it'd be hard for me to pick it up and look for it again, this was an anti-communist move on the part of Japan. Most people do not understand that Japan was very, very afraid of communist Russia. And you had Mao Zedong all over China. You had Chiang Kai-shek, who turned anti-communist, but he had been initially trained militarily in Russia. So it was very up in the air whether he was really turned against the communists or not, or whether it was a personality conflict. The Japanese went into Manchuria. Yes, they went in for natural resources, but one of those strong steps behind it was to block the expansion of communist Russia. They feared it. And they even said so in their communiques to Roosevelt, that they feared the expansion of communism in the Far East. This does not excuse what they did, but it shows some insight behind some of the things that they did. There were individuals in Japan who wanted peace, but because we constantly rebuffed them, ignored them, and made things even worse to invite an attack, if you look at the history, by the policies of President Roosevelt, it gave the power ultimately to the militarists, and we got war. These are things that you don't read about in your history books. If you go back into your antique bookstores, look at old newspapers, look at old magazines, you'll find that a lot of this stuff is still in those antique bookstores, but they've gone down the memory hole when it comes to putting them into television today and into history books today. Just a little insight as to the complicity of our government in lying to our own people about what we're doing overseas with our money, whether it's 70 years ago or whether it's today. These things go on. And so we always have to be patriotic, support our country, but take a look at some things that our government is doing to bring about war, not just back in 1941, but also in 2012 rather.
How did he know? Betrayal at Pearl Harbor was written by James Russ Bridger and Eric Nave in 1991. Nave had in fact broken the Japanese naval cipher in 1939, and Russ Bridger was a former M16 intelligence officer. The backgrounds of these two co-authors give the book much publicity and credence. The central claim of Betrayal at Pearl Harbor was that Britain had broken the Japanese codes and knew of the attack in advance. On November 25, 1941, Japan's Admiral Yamamoto sent a radio message to the group of Japanese warships that would attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Newly released naval records prove that from November 17th to the 25th, the United States Navy intercepted 83 messages that Yamamoto sent to his carriers. Part of the November 25th messages read, and I quote, "The task force, keeping its movements strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities, shall attack the main force in the United States fleet in Hawaii and deal it with a mortal blow." We knew in 1945 that FDR had known in December 1941, as seen in this newspaper heading, and this one, and this proof in his own words. Here is a quote from Franklin D. Roosevelt. "In politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet that it was planned that way." FDR wrote his speech on December 7th. Point 3. U.S. naval fleet in the Pacific was anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. On Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, while most American sailors were still asleep in their bunks, Japanese aircraft carriers flew over Pearl Harbor. Planes and submarines of the Imperial Japanese Navy began a surprise attack on the U.S. under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi. Japanese planes from aircraft carriers flew over Pearl Harbor, bombing every ship in sight. The attack of Pearl Harbor lasted less than 2 hours. 2,403 Americans were killed, including over 1,100 when the battleship Arizona sank. 68 civilians were killed, almost 1,200 were wounded, and approximately 150 airplanes were destroyed, as well as 20 warships sunk. Newspaper titled "Dewey Kept Secret That U.S. Agents Cracked Jap Code Prior to Attack" says that Roosevelt and his advisors knew what the Japanese were going to do well in advance of the overt rupture of relations. More than 15 hours before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt and the members of the Washington High Command knew that the Japanese envoys were going to break with the U.S. the next day. It also states that Roosevelt knew the Japanese were going to attack 15 hours before Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was a surprise to U.S. citizens. American people were stunned by an attack on Pearl Harbor. However, high government officials knew that attack somewhere in the Pacific was imminent because they had broken Japanese codes. The attack was a partial surprise to government officials. Government officials did not know the exact target and date for the attack. Many believed the attack would be in the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, or Malaya. Attack might not have been surprised if vital intelligence information was passed to the Navy Commander Admiral Kimmel. There were promises not to recognize Israel. The United States under President Franklin D. Roosevelt was interested in cultivating the friendship of Arab countries because of the need to protect U.S. petroleum interests. And in particular, Roosevelt was interested in the friendship of Saudi Arabia. According to some sources, King Ibn Saud was interested in the plan for a Jewish state that was formulated by his advisor and confidant, British archaeologist and diplomat Harry St. John Philby. The plan was put to Chaim Weizmann and other Zionist leaders. Eventually, the U.S. administration became interested. At the beginning of July 1943, U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull gave Colonel Henry Hopkins, not Harry Hopkins as stated in some accounts, a directive from Roosevelt ordering him to proceed to Saudi Arabia to ascertain whether Ibn Saud would enter into discussions with Dr. Chaim Weizmann or other representatives selected by the Jewish Agency for the purpose of seeking a solution of basic problems acceptable to both Arabs and Jews. Hoskins met King Abdul Aziz on August 14, 1943, but according to Hoskins, Saud rebuffed the Philby plan and what he claimed was Weizmann's proposal to bribe him. Later, Roosevelt met Saud in the Suez Canal. President Roosevelt tried to persuade Saud to acquire a plan for the Jewish immigration to Palestine, but Saud was adamant in his opposition. 1 week before his death, in a letter dated April, by 1940, U.S. relations with Japan were becoming increasingly strained. This is because Japan's invasion of China and territorial ambitions to extend its conquest to Southeast Asia. My fourth point is politics. Here we see the America First Committee, which was formed in 1940 and had an estimated 800,000 members at its height. Its most prominent leader was Charles Lindbergh. It advocated building up U.S. defenses and staying out of Europe's problems, and dissolved 4 days after Pearl Harbor. Here, Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Selective Service Act of 1940, which was the first peacetime draft in U.S. All men aged 21 to 35 were required to register, later 18 to 65. Required men were picked for duty to serve 12 months, the service in the U.S. or its positions. The only way to get the U.S. behind the war is to get Japan to attack, as shown in these posters. Franklin D. Roosevelt had made a quarantine speech in 1937, calling for an international quarantine of the aggressor nations as an alternate to the political climate of American neutrality and isolationism that was prevalent at the time. The speech intensified Americans' isolationist mood, causing protests by isolationists and foes to intervene, aggressive actions by Italy and Japan, and suggested the use of economic pressure, a forceful response, but less direct than outright aggression. FDR, October 1937, speech sets the tone for economic sanctions. Roosevelt's quarantine speech, October 5, 1937. Hopes for global peace are undermined by aggressor states. Foundations of civilization are threatened. The U.S. and Western Hemisphere are also in danger. Complete isolation from the world is not possible. U.S. must reestablish international law and morality. War is like a disease. It must be quarantined to protect the world. With that speech, FDR sounds alarm that Americans must now take notice of global problems. The Japanese response was the USS Panay bombing December 1937. Around 10 o'clock in the morning of December 13, 1937, New York Times correspondent Hallett Abend received an unexpected visitor. Rear Admiral Taro Hondo of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Abend was in Shanghai covering the Sino-Japanese war that had been raging since the previous July. And while unexpected, the visit was not entirely out of the ordinary. America was in the International Settlement, a foreign enclave of the city that was ruled by largely Anglo-American municipal council not subject to Chinese law. After the sinking, Japan agreed to pay $2 million for damage. They killed 3 American soldiers and 45 people were injured. In 1940, Japan was allied with Germany and Italy as one of its Axis powers. Hitler's success in Europe provided an opportunity for Japanese expansion into Southeast Asia, British Burma, and French Indochina. Territories held as colonies by European nations. European nations were too preoccupied with stopping Hitler's expansion in Europe. When Japan joined the Axis in September 1940, FDR responded by prohibiting the export of all steel and scrap iron to all countries except Britain and nations of the Western Hemisphere. His action was aimed at Japan, which protested that it was an unfriendly act. In July 1941, Japanese troops occupied French Indochina. FDR cut off Japanese access to vital materials, including U.S. oil. Both sides, US and Japan, realized that Japan needed oil to fuel its navy and the air force. If the US embargo on oil did not end, Japan would be forced to extend its conquest by taking oil resources in Dutch East Indies. Secretary of State Hull insisted that Japan pull its troops out of China, which Japan refused to do so. This was a violation of open door policy. Japanese ambassador to the US tried to negotiate and change the US policy regarding oil. The agreement seemed unlikely. In October, a new Japanese government headed by General Hideki Tojo made a final attempt at negotiating an agreement. Neither side changed its position. FDR's military advisors hoped that an armed confrontation with Japan would be delayed until U.S. armed forces in the Pacific were sufficiently strong. Japan believed that quick action was necessary due to its limited oil supplies. Why did Japan attack America? Well, Japan was trying to become the dominant power in East Asia and the Pacific. They had invaded China in 1933 and were preparing to conquer Indochina, Malaysia, and the Pacific Islands. The U.S. had been growing steadily and was more opposed to Japanese expansion. Japan knew that if they attacked those other countries, the U.S. might go to war and stop them. Japan attacked America because they wanted to control our territories and could use our oil and raw materials that were needed for their own businesses. Japan decided to attack us first. They hoped to hurt us so they could obtain more territory while we were indisposed. Once they had it, they hoped to make peace with America, keeping said territory. However, not all were happy in Japan. This is a quote from Isoroku Yamamoto. He said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken the sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve." Here are some suspicious facts of the attack. 1. Virtually all the warships at Pearl Harbor were obsolete and left over from World War I and lined up and tied together. 2. All of our carriers and most of our newer warships were not at Pearl. They were at sea. Coincidence? We don't believe in coincidences. 3. There is no doubt that the U.S. knew an attack was coming and that Pearl would be hit. 4. Most U.S. citizens and most of Congress were isolationists and or pacifists. 5. Only a few days prior to the attack, the Army was ordered to cluster and line up their aircraft, fighters, and bombers instead of dispersing them. 6. Radar warnings were ignored by the higher-ups on the morning of December 7th. FDR knew and manipulated the U.S. and Japan into war. This conspiracy is as follows. Many people believe that FDR and the government allowed the Pearl Harbor attack to occur to gain the public support for World War II. This theory states that the U.S. government sacrificed Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was a single piece in an intricate game of chess. FDR manipulates Japan to attack. In 1941, President Roosevelt takes America into the Second World War by refusing to sell Japan any more steel scraps or oil. Japan was in the midst of a war against China, and without the scrap steel and oil, Japan would be unable to continue that war. Japan was totally dependent upon the United States for both steel, scrap, and oil. Roosevelt knew this action would provoke the Japanese to attack America, which they subsequently did at Pearl Harbor. There was one major change in FDR. Leahy, who was the chairman of Navy's Medical Consulting Board, would ultimately agree on the diagnosis of Dr. Howard Brand, a cardiologist at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. Prompted by Roosevelt's concerned daughter, Brand had been asked by McIntyre to examine him further. Brand diagnosed the president with heart failure due to hypertensive heart disease and recommended rest, salt restriction, and weight loss and prescribed digitalis, a heart medication. This spurred McIntyre to get additional opinions from two naval medical consultants, one of whom was Leahy. Leahy concurred with the diagnosis of heart failure and this was a presentation by Next Generation researchers. Conspiracy? You decide. We presented you with the facts, and now you decide the truth. In today's society, you are told what to think, but we are prompting you to stop and acknowledge this evidence. Think of how we are being deprived of our precious freedom daily. Remember December 7th, 1941, where Americans lost their lives because of the lies of our government. Conspiracy? You decide.